In this lecture, we will discuss conflict impacts on the environment, how environmental cooperation can be sustained during conflict, and how environmental management can be part of building a durable peace in the aftermath of conflicts. The effects of conflict on the environment are, with very few exceptions, pretty disastrous. Those few exceptions are typically associated with large interstate conflicts. Interstate wars sometimes create no man's land, where human activity is limited due to fighting or defensive perimeters. In these conditions, some ecosystems and organisms can flourish. For example, during World War I, Germany and Great Britain sought to enforce naval blockades on one another and used both surface craft and submarines to police the waters of the North Sea. Sailors, both naval and merchant, came to fear the dreaded German U-boats, which could attack seemingly without warning from below the surface. Fearful of being sunk, many fishing vessels stayed in port. Once the war ended in 1918, European fishers reported significantly higher catch rates and significantly larger fish, both signs of a flourishing population. Freed from years of fishing at pressure, the fisheries of the North Sea grew larger and healthier. Another example can be found in what is perhaps the most dangerous territory on Earth, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, between North and South Korea. The roughly 4-kilometer wide, 238-kilometer long zone has become a conservation haven for several endangered or vulnerable species, like white-naped cranes and mountain gorals. However, the conservation-promoting effects of conflict are not to be overestimated. By and large, conflict is as destructive to the environment as it is to the human populations that wage it and on which it is waged. Fundamentally, warfare is about imposing costs on one's enemies in order to compel or coerce them to do something, leave territory, change their behavior, or provide some sort of tribute or acquiescence. Sometimes it's about imposing cost for cost's sake, that is, simply to punish. One way to impose cost is to make habitat unlivable. Historical accounts of, quote, salting the earth, end quote, spreading salt, minerals, and invasive weeds in order to make arable land unsuitable for planting, date back to at least the Assyrian Empire, which lasted from roughly 2500 to 605 before the Common Era. Though these stories may actually be more folklore than fact, it has been common practice since the dawn of large-scale warfare for armies to destroy crops and farmland in order to coerce starving populations. In conflicts from the Second Boer War in South Africa around the turn of the 20th century to present-day South Sudan, food denial and crop eradication has been used both against combatants and civilians. Now, landmines and unexploded ordnance can have similar effects. Landmines are a very cheap and easy way to set a defensive perimeter or cover a retreat. Especially in the latter circumstance, many of these minefields are never recorded. No one writes down where they are, and no one remembers. Despite demining efforts, many places are still considered no-go zones, both for agricultural and animal grazing purposes. Harming the environment in order to deny adversaries cover or refuge is a second direct effect. This is especially common in the context of counterinsurgency, where large armies often confront small, lightly armed, and irregular opposition forces. So U.S. campaigns against Iraqi Sunni insurgents in Al-Anbar and the Viet Cong in Vietnam are two examples of counterinsurgency campaigns. Because insurgent forces are almost always outnumbered and outgunned, they tend to rely on guerrilla tactics that make use of cover provided by forests, tall grasslands, marshes, and mountains, hence the term head for the hills, which meant to retreat and regroup to an area of rough terrain. Frustrated by these tactics, government forces sometimes resort to attacking the very environment that provides cover. During Operation Ranch Hand, which lasted from 1961 to 1972, U.S. airplanes dropped an estimated 20 million gallons of herbicides and defoliants on South Vietnam, destroying 20,000 square kilometers of forest, an area roughly the size of the state of New Jersey. Some of these chemicals, like Agent Orange, were highly toxic and left lasting legacies of cancer and birth defects among the Vietnamese population and among the U.S. service persons who handled them or were exposed to them.
What do you get when you mix 2,4,5-T acid and 2,4-D acid? You get a powerful herbicide that the United States military used during the Vietnam War, and one that's been tied to serious health problems for the people exposed to it. The answer is Agent Orange. Agent Orange was just one of a series of heavy-duty chemicals the U.S. military used in Southeast Asia, called rainbow herbicides. There were also agents blue, pink, green, purple, and white, but orange was the big one. Some 20 million gallons were sprayed on Southeast Asian jungles, fields, and other targets over a 9-year period from 1962 to 1971. It was part of what the U.S. military called Operation Ranch Hand, aiming to defoliate the South Vietnamese countryside. The goal was to rob the Viet Cong of food sources and places to hide. This kind of scorched earth fighting, clearing the land of anything the enemy could use, is an ancient military tactic. But using chemicals to do that was a pretty recent invention. England and the US developed tactical herbicides during World War II, but didn't really use them. Herbicidal warfare was first used by the British in the 1950s in what's now Malaysia. The US saw that and said, that could work for us in Vietnam. Thus, Operation Ranch Hand. But it would come with a price. In addition to those 2 chemicals I mentioned earlier, Agent Orange also contains something else, called TCDD, the most toxic of a class of chemicals called dioxins. Dioxins are dangerous, even in minute amounts. Veterans returning from Vietnam started reporting these health problems in increasing numbers: cancer, birth defects, miscarriages, and skin diseases, among other issues. Over 2.5 million US soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange during the war. And let's not forget about the Vietnamese. Researchers in Vietnam claim that some 2 million cancers and other diseases, and 500,000 birth defects, were caused in that country by exposure to Agent Orange. And despite some bilateral cleanup efforts, the chemicals continue to pollute the soil there to this day. The fighting in Vietnam may be long over, but its legacy haunts both sides of the conflict, thanks in part to Agent Orange.
Now, this strategy, however, is not new. Julius Caesar's Roman armies would routinely cut down forests during European campaigns in order to protect themselves from hit-and-run tactics. And retreating Soviet armies burned crops rather than allowing them to be captured by advancing Germans during Operation Barbarossa in World War II. Deliberate destruction of the environment is part of some warfighting strategies. Now, warfighting also affects the environment through indirect channels as well. Some of the indirect effects are pretty straightforward. Warfighting invariably destroys some of the surrounding environment. Tanks leak diesel fuel and rip up surface vegetation. Armies forage for food and fuel, harvesting food and plants as they go. And bombs destroy both their intended targets and surrounding ecosystems. Even preparations for conflict can have deep and lasting environmental consequences. During the Cold War, nuclear powers conducted 423 above-ground and over 1,400 underground nuclear tests, releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere and the ground. Just storing and maintaining these nuclear arsenals comes with significant environmental costs. Similarly, the carbon footprint of modern mechanized warfare is huge and has grown larger over time. During World War II, the U.S. military consumed roughly 1 gallon of fuel per soldier per day. By 2006, that number was up to 16. On a daily basis, the U.S. military was consuming as much gasoline as the entire country of Sweden at the peak of the Iraq War. Outside of nuclear aircraft carriers and submarines, most weapons of war are not alternative fuel vehicles. War is incredibly energy intensive, and most of this energy comes from burning fossil fuels. Other indirect effects are byproducts of how human populations try to cope with war dynamics. First, wars almost always displace people, leading to unsustainable coping strategies. This is true of both large-scale interstate wars and civil conflicts, but the effects are even more pronounced for civil conflicts, as many governments and rebels resort to, quote, draining the sea, end quote, forcibly depopulating areas where the enemy is thought to be active in order to separate insurgents and or government sympathizers from combatants. Refugees often wind up inhabiting marginal lands with few economic prospects. If those lands weren't marginal, they'd probably be inhabited already. And this makes them dependent on humanitarian assistance and unsustainable foraging strategies for food, shelter, and energy. For example, refugees of the Rwandan Civil War in the Democratic Republic of Congo deforested roughly 38 square kilometers, an area about half the size of San Francisco, within 3 weeks of their arrival in and around the city of Goma near the Rwandan-DRC border. Former Rwandan rebels pushed into DRC were implicated in the slaughter of already endangered highland mountain gorillas for bushmeat. These foraging practices harm both ecosystems and the wildlife they support. Another indirect effect brought on by coping is that war promotes unsustainable harvesting practices. Wartime often causes breakdowns in social order and the rule of law, the belief that usage rights will be enforced and protected in the future. When this happens, people who normally have incentives to take the long view and carefully tend to their herds or their fields or their orchards instead worry that they will not have access to them in the future, and thus overharvest them in the present. Surveyors found after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 that half the country's natural pistachio woodlands had been cut down in order to sell wood or hoard it for future use. Given how long pistachio trees take to mature, it was the early 2010s before those orchards could be regrown and returned to production. Conflict leads to unsustainable and short-sighted harvesting practices that can undermine the long-term viability of the resource, and the case study you read about Lake Victoria and the Nile perch fishery illustrates this even further. Finally, the same breakdowns in order and the rule of law provide opportunities for illegal activities. In wartime, insurgents, local warlords, and often members of the military are able to make substantial fortunes trafficking in illegally harvested resources. These resources include everything from conflict timber, like exotic, sometimes endangered hardwoods, to conflict fish, rhino horn, and ivory. These resources have received less attention than conflict minerals, the non-renewable, highly lucrative minerals like diamonds, gold, and tungsten, but their overharvesting can lead to biodiversity loss and permanent change in ecosystems. So we've established the negative consequences for the environment are pretty severe. But in some conflict zones, cooperative relations can persist between natural resource managers, even as tensions between the governments fray. We'll look at two examples, the Indus River Commission and transboundary management of mountain gorillas in the Virunga Massif. The Indus River Commission was created in 1960 via the Indus Waters Treaty, after 9 years of negotiation between India and Pakistan with the help of the World Bank, which also signed the agreement and provided financing. Seen as one of the most successful international treaties, it has survived frequent tensions, including conflict, and has provided a framework for irrigation and hydropower development for more than half a century in the subcontinent. Former U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower described it as one bright spot in a very depressing world picture that we see so often. Now, as discussed in the context of water wars, India and Pakistan are among the most likely countries for a dispute over their shared waters. They have upstream-downstream relationships. One is a democracy, that's India, and one is a managed democracy at best, with the military exerting an outsized impact on politics, that's Pakistan. And the two have a history of prior armed conflicts, going all the way back to the partition of the two countries in 1947, and large continuing religious differences between the two countries. Now, one of the reasons that the Indus River Treaty works, and a reason that's common to a lot of transboundary co-management institutions, like governance of the Virunga, is the difference between the high politics of statecraft and the low politics of natural resource management. National leaders face a variety of incentives and have competing claims on their actions and public positions. Moreover, they are responsible for ginning up political support. It's how they became leaders in the first place. For this reason, they tend to see environmental issues as a tool of broader statecraft, a leverage point in negotiations, or a chip that can be traded for concessions on some other issue. On the other hand, natural resource managers are nature-loving nerds. Seriously, go to a political convention and it's veneers, coiffed hair, and megawatt smiles sported by ambitious people as far as the eye can see. Go to the American Fisheries Society meetings, and it's people who often look like they just got done fishing. Shorts, ball caps, Teva sandals, and I'm talking about Teva sandals before they became cool again. Now, Google hydrologists. As you can see, these are not exactly fussy people. That is, they are practical people who are concerned with the best interest of the resource at hand. Their job is very specific to managing that resource, and because of the dominance of northern institutions in many scientific matters, often the natural resource managers on opposite sides of the table or a border went to school together. For instance, members of the Permanent Indus Commission might have watched cricket together in London. Members of the Interstate Commission for Water Coordination of Central Asia, which governs the Aral Sea, may have studied together in Moscow. They are unconcerned with the high politics of India-Pakistan relations or Kazakh-Uzbek relations. They have a defined and unglamorous, highly technical job to do. As such, in times of tensions, they can often reach out to one another as colleagues and old friends, rather than as government officials, or at least combine those roles and bring them to the negotiating table. It's one of the reasons scientists are so often part of Track 2, or unofficial diplomatic efforts. The nerd tribe, of which yours truly is a proud member, is a decidedly cosmopolitan group. In the last couple of years alone, I've published or funded work on fisheries resources with Kenyan, Ugandan, Japanese, and Filipino scientists, and I'm currently serving on the IPCC with a Norwegian, a Belgian, and an Indian, all a mix of men and women. The sciences certainly have problems with gender and racial and ethnic biases, but our nerdiness unites us in ways our national identities might not. And unlike politicians or the global business elite, we know we're not getting rich or famous or powerful. Those goals do not complicate, to as great an extent, our shared work. Now let's look at the Virunga in greater detail.
They look when you say their name.
Yeah, I'm like their mother.
Yeah.
If I go there inside, all of them, they like to jump on my back, to play with me. Yeah, we are good friends. Yeah.
At the Rangers' headquarters in eastern Congo, there is a gorilla orphanage. Andre Boerma has been protecting the gorillas for almost 20 years.
In 2007, we had gorilla massacre. The first gorilla who was killed, it was Nakasi's mother.
The biggest one?
Yeah. After 1 month, we had a second baby. It was Ndeze. Maisha is the oldest gorilla. She is a boss.
Baby gorillas fetch a huge price on the black market, and poachers have killed entire families to capture just one of them. Poaching had contributed to a dwindling population, which many feared could lead to extinction. How do you feel seeing them inside an enclosure like this?
It's not good because they are not in their natural habitat. But we are providing our effort so that one day they can be like other gorillas in the forest. Virunga will be alive forever.
Virunga is one of Africa's most biodiverse national parks, home to a quarter of the critically endangered mountain gorillas. The rangers here risk their lives to protect them. So I stumbled across a graveyard just like this 13 or 14 years ago. This is for rangers who have been killed, and back then 1 in 7 rangers had been killed doing their job. I came back 10 years ago and actually put me through their whole training program and made me become a kind of honorary advanced force ranger. I got a green beret and a jacket, went out patrol with them. And back then it looked bleak. It looked like they were fighting a losing battle and that the hippos and gorillas we were seeing could be the last ones here because there were so many rebels and so few rangers. And the world just wasn't paying attention. So I always wanted to come back to show what heroes these rangers are. And they still face serious physical danger because there are still loads of armed groups within the park. Over 150 rangers have died protecting the park. 5 more were killed by rebels just 2 weeks ago. But now the park itself is under threat. Illegal charcoal production, one of the rebels' main sources of income, has caused mass deforestation and presents a new threat to the wildlife here. Innocent Buranwe leads armed patrols looking for illegal charcoal producers.
Contrôler, et s'il y aura des fours, on va les détruire. Il ne faut pas chuchoter, il ne faut pas parloter pour que les braconniers puissent nous entendre.
Within a few kilometers of their base, the rangers hear the sound of trees being chopped.
By the sounds, there is some people who are cutting trees. So it means that they are cutting trees for just making charcoal.
Can you hear it? Very, very close. The poachers escaped.
You can see that this place has been invaded by poachers. You can hear some voices. That is the one who ran away. Then he's warning his colleagues. They cut trees like that one, then they start carrying, then they come like here. And after 1 week, you'll find the charcoal has been formed. He's supposed to cut about 50 trees.
Charcoal is made by chopping down trees and slowly burning them in an easily assembled kiln. It's then transported out of the forest and sold to the nearly 4 million people who live around the park. For the rebels, it's a hugely lucrative business. Another kiln, and you can still smell the burning wood, so I think this is very recently used. This just shows how widespread it is, and this is right under the noses of the rangers. Big area's been cleared.
Yeah, this place is empty.
So another kiln. This may not look like much, but thousands of people are doing this across the park. Some people think the value of this trade is $35 million a year. So that gives you a sense of how much damage is being done. Charcoal production has destroyed at least 30,000 square kilometers of forest in Africa. To see the scope of this deforestation, we flew with the head of Virunga, a Belgian prince named Emmanuel de Moreau, who took over in 2008.
That's actually a known FDLR position. Now we're going to get to about 1,500 feet, and then we can fly over it.
Out of shooting range?
Yeah, it would be safer. You've got some charcoal burning just there. A big part of the problem isn't just the forest destruction, it's also the effect it has on stability and peace in the region. It's one of the main incentives for war. It's these illegal armed groups, these militias, that are essentially funded by the trafficking of illegally acquired natural resources, of which one of the most important is charcoal. I mean, it's enough to supply over 1 million people with fuel. And it's a very, very complex problem because those people need fuel. You know, without it they can't cook their food, and they need it for their health because they need to sterilize the water they drink. We can't deprive them of domestic fuel. It would create a humanitarian disaster.
Emmanuel's solution is to completely reinvent the local economy. Central to this is the construction of 8 hydroelectric plants that will provide cheap power to the entire population here, using Virunga's own natural resources to end the deforestation that is causing such devastation.
Virunga National Park can create between 100 and 120 megawatts. That's 20 times what the whole city of Goma, a city of 1 million people, is getting at the moment. You know, with the electricity that can be generated from Virunga, we can create between 80 and 120,000 jobs in the province.
The Congolese military, the UN peacekeeping force here, the biggest in the world, haven't been able to defeat the rebel groups militarily, but you think you could just make them choose to stop fighting because there's a better alternative for them?
You know, they're here to make money. Until you provide an alternative, you're not going to resolve the conflict.
But in the short term, you're removing a large source of income for those armed groups, so you're making some serious enemies.
Well, you know, it's not a popularity contest. That's true.
That's an understatement. Emmanuel was shot 4 times immediately after filing a complaint against an oil company exploring the park. He was lucky to survive.
So each one of these turbines will produce more electricity than the whole city of Goma is getting at the moment. So really, it's a huge transformation for the area.
Congo remains one of the most violent places on Earth, but there are real signs of progress here. Thanks to the efforts of the rangers, the long-endangered species that live here could actually survive. At another park ranger headquarters, at Kahuzi Biega, I found the man who trained me 11 years ago, Eli Mundima. Ah! How are you? Good to see you again.
How are you?
How are you? Good to see you. He took me out on patrol to see how the gorilla population has fared since I was last here.
You will see gorillas. Maybe. Let's continue.
You promised last time and you kept your promise. 11 years ago, we found a lone silverback gorilla. This time, Ellie showed me something that would have been unimaginable back then. Incredible.
Это камера купили чего? Это не хотелось.
Babies keep wanting to get closer and come and say hello. But the closer the babies get, the more uncomfortable the silverback gets.
He's making eye contact, so I'm having to look away. Back in 2006, it looked like maybe the gorillas were finished. Maybe they would be gone in a few years' time.
Because of training, they train rangers. Now, those rangers who are well trained, they are protect gorillas. The number of gorillas is growing up. That's the reason why we meet this family, this big family.
To see 12.
Yeah, you've count them, I think.
12?
Yeah, the whole family.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
It makes me want to be a ranger again.
Of course.
There were less than 700 mountain gorillas left in the world when I was here in 2006. Now, there are approximately 1,000. This progress is remarkable. And although the gorillas are still endangered, it looks, for the first time in a long time, as if there is a good chance it will continue. You can't hear me?
To make a wave. Good.
Very good.
As a last point, let's talk about the role of natural resource management in peacebuilding. All conflicts eventually end, but they are likely to restart if the fundamental causes, like inequality or mistreatment of certain populations, environmental degradation, and resource loss, are not actually addressed. Peacebuilding is an approach to building lasting peace in the post-conflict period. Peacebuilding aims to reduce the risk of relapse into violence by addressing the root causes of conflicts, improving social cohesion and reconciliation among groups, and creating capacities and institutions that can manage disputes so that they do not evolve into violence. Peacebuilding is as much about an outcome as it is about a process. If, for example, various groups are involved in the design, implementation, and evaluation of natural resource management projects, the interactions and dialogue among these groups can build social cohesion and reduce the risk of violence. One of the most favored strategies is the creation of co-management institutions. As we discussed in the context of common pool resources, co-management institutions are arrangements where community stakeholders, i.e. the resource users, work collectively to govern the resource. Where these institutions are effective, they tend to produce broader peace dividends as well, in part by turning the competing resource users into co-management-oriented nerds, like the professional managers we looked at earlier. These kinds of co-management arrangements turn strangers and competitors into people with shared skin in the game and social ties, and can produce both better development outcomes and contribute to lasting peace. This lecture has outlined the almost uniformly negative effects of armed conflict for the environment, but has also presented several silver linings: how resource management can facilitate cooperation even in context of high tensions, and how effective resource management can contribute to resolving conflicts and preventing the occurrence of new ones. Next time, we'll begin tackling the broad links between climate change and security.